We don't serve people dressed like that." The sentence landed before Naomi Carter had even fully stepped inside, the glass door still whispering shut behind her as a soft chime echoed through the dining room. And for a brief second, everything slowed. Forks paused halfway to mouths. Low conversations dipped just enough to make space for the discomfort, and Naomi stood there in a simple navy dress and worn heels, feeling the weight of a room she had built from the ground up press back against her like it didn't recognize her anymore. The hostess, Sophie, didn't smile, didn't blink, just looked Naomi up and down with a practiced kind of dismissal that had nothing to do with policy and everything to do with assumption. While the warm amber lights above reflected off polished wood tables Naomi had once chosen herself, tables meant to welcome people, not measure them. Naomi inhaled slowly, steady, controlled, the faint scent of grilled salmon and garlic butter filling her lungs, familiar, almost comforting, if not for the way. It now felt like it belonged to someone else's world, and she glanced to her left where a young black girl sat beside her mother, eyes wide, watching, learning, absorbing something Naomi had spent her entire life trying to change. "I'm just asking for a table," Naomi said quietly, her voice even, not challenging, not submissive, just present. But Sophie shifted her weight and crossed her arms, reinforcing the invisible line she had already drawn, and somewhere behind the bar a glass clinked a little too loudly, the sound sharp in the tightening air. Footsteps approached, measured and confident, and Ethan Brooks appeared, the manager, crisp white shirt, sleeves perfectly rolled, the kind of man who believed order meant control, and his gaze didn't linger long, just enough to categorize, to decide, to align himself without hesitation. "Is there a problem?" he asked, though his tone suggested the problem had already been identified, and when Naomi met his eyes, there was a flicker, just a flicker, of something unplaceable, but it vanished as quickly as it came. "Your staff says I don't meet the standard," she replied, calm, and Ethan gave a small, polite nod, the kind reserved for dismissals wrapped in professionalism. "We maintain a certain atmosphere here," he said, his voice smooth, practiced, carrying just far enough for nearby tables to hear, without seeming intentional. And a couple at the window shifted uncomfortably while another guest subtly angled their phone. Naomi let the silence stretch, not out of hesitation, but intention, her gaze drifting briefly across the room, past the open kitchen where flames danced under steel pans, past the framed reviews on the wall, past the soft glow that had once meant pride, and then back to Ethan. "Are you sure?" she asked, her tone unchanged, but something in the question hung heavier than it should have, like it carried more than just words. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly, a decision settling in. "I'm sure," he said, and Sophie stepped half a pace closer, emboldened, the boundary now solid, visible, final. Naomi nodded once, slow, almost thoughtful, and then, without raising her voice, without breaking her composure, she reached into her bag, fingers brushing against cool glass before pulling out her phone, the screen lighting up against her palm as the room held its breath without knowing why. And for the first time since she walked in, the power in the space shifted, subtle but undeniable, like the moment before a storm changes direction, and Naomi lifted her eyes again, steady, grounded, as her thumb hovered over a contact that would turn the next 60 seconds into something no one in that room would ever forget. Naomi's thumb hovered for half a second before she tapped the screen, and the quiet click of that single motion somehow carried farther than any raised voice in the room, as if the air itself had decided to listen. She did not rush, did not explain, did not look away, and while the call connected, Ethan shifted slightly, the confidence in his posture still intact but no longer effortless, like a man who had just stepped onto uncertain ground without realizing it yet. "Who are you calling?" he asked, his tone measured, controlled, but edged now with something tighter, and Naomi did not answer right away, instead letting her gaze drift once more across the dining room, taking in every detail, the low hum of conversation trying to recover, the faint clatter of silverware that sounded almost forced, the reflection of light on glass that used to feel like pride and now felt like distance. Then she spoke, calm and clear, regional operations, as if she were simply confirming a reservation, and the words did not land loudly, but they landed deep, subtle enough that most guests did not react, yet precise enough that Ethan's expression changed by a fraction, just enough to notice if you were watching closely. Behind the hostess stand, Sophie's arms loosened slightly, her certainty flickering as she glanced at Ethan for reassurance, but he held his ground, lifting his chin a little higher, doubling down on the version of reality he had already committed to. "That will not be necessary," he said, his voice still smooth, still professional, but now just a shade firmer than before, as if trying to regain control of something he could feel slipping. Naomi ended the call without another word, slipping the phone back into her bag with the same quiet precision. And for a moment, nothing happened, no alarms, no sudden revelations, just the steady pulse of a restaurant trying to continue as if nothing had shifted, yet the shift was there, threading through the space like a current beneath calm water. A server passing by slowed just enough to glance at Naomi, curiosity replacing indifference, while the couple near the window leaned closer together, whispering, and the young girl at the table still had not looked away, her small hands resting on the edge of the table as if she were holding onto the moment itself. Ethan checked the tablet in his hand, almost casually, but his thumb paused mid-swipe when a new notification appeared, a subtle change in the screen's glow reflecting in his eyes, and he frowned slightly, not understanding yet, just sensing that something did not align. Naomi remained still, her posture relaxed, her shoulders steady, not triumphant, not anxious, just present in a way that felt immovable, like she was anchored to something deeper than the room around her. And when she finally spoke again, her voice was softer than before, almost reflective. "I built this place so people would feel seen the moment they walked in," she said, not accusing, not emotional, just stating something that had once been true, and the words hung there, quiet but undeniable, settling into the polished wood and warm light like a memory the room had forgotten. Sophie swallowed, her gaze dropping for a brief second before lifting again, uncertainty now visible, while Ethan's tablet buzzed once more, sharper this time, pulling his full attention, and as he opened the message, the color in his face shifted, not dramatically, not all at once, but enough to break the perfect composure he had held since the beginning. And in that small, fragile crack, the room began to realize that whatever was about to happen next was no longer under his control. The faint vibration in Ethan's hand seemed louder than it should have been, a sharp contrast to the controlled calm he had worn like a uniform just moments ago. And as he stared at the screen, the polished confidence that defined him began to thin, not collapse, not yet, but stretch in a way that made it fragile. He read the message once, then again, slower, as if the meaning might change the second time, but it did not. And the name at the top of the notification did not belong to a guest, did not belong to a supplier. It belonged to someone far above his level, someone who never reached out directly unless something had already gone very wrong. Around him, the restaurant continued its quiet performance, but it was no longer seamless. A fork scraped too sharply against a plate, a glass was set down just a little too hard, and even the low music playing overhead felt distant, like it had stepped back to watch. Sophie leaned slightly toward him, her voice barely above a whisper. "What is it?" But Ethan did not answer, not immediately, his eyes still fixed on the tablet as another message appeared beneath the first, this one shorter, more direct, and whatever composure he had left shifted again, subtle but undeniable, like a crack spreading through glass that had once looked flawless. Naomi watched him without expression, not cold, not warm, simply present, her stillness grounding the moment in a way that made everything else feel temporary. And for the first time since she walked in, she did not look like someone asking for a seat. She looked like someone waiting for the truth to arrive on its own. Ethan cleared his throat, a small, controlled sound, and lifted his head, but the words he had prepared did not come out the same way. "Ma'am," he began, more formal now, more careful, as if he were suddenly aware that every syllable mattered. But even that shift did not restore what had already begun to unravel. Naomi tilted her head slightly, not in challenge, but in quiet acknowledgement, and the movement was enough to draw the attention of a nearby table where a man had stopped mid-bite, his eyes now openly fixed on the unfolding scene. The young girl at the corner table leaned forward just a fraction, her gaze moving from Naomi to Ethan and back again. trying to understand what was changing, trying to make sense of why. The room felt different without knowing the reason. Ethan glanced back down at the tablet, then toward the hostess stand where Sophie stood frozen between confidence and doubt. And for a moment, it became clear that he was recalculating, searching for a way to hold on to control that was no longer his to define. "There may have been a misunderstanding," he said finally, the words careful, measured, but noticeably softer, as if he were testing a new reality he had not expected to enter. And Sophie's posture shifted immediately, her shoulders dropping just enough to reveal the uncertainty she could no longer hide. Naomi did not respond right away, allowing the silence to stretch again, deeper this time, heavier, until even the background noise seemed to hesitate. And when she did speak, her voice was steady, grounded, carrying no anger, only clarity. "There was no misunderstanding," she said, and the simplicity of it removed any place left to hide. Ethan exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that signaled a shift from control to recognition. And as another notification flashed across his screen, this one unmistakably urgent, the realization settled in fully, not dramatic, not explosive, but absolute. And in that quiet, irreversible moment, the room no longer belonged to him. It never had, and the truth was about to make that undeniable. The silence did not break all at once. It thinned slowly, like tension being pulled too far to hold, and Ethan's fingers tightened slightly around the tablet as the latest message settled into something final, something that did not ask for interpretation anymore. He looked up again, but this time there was no performance left to lean on, no polished tone ready to smooth things over. Only a careful awareness that every person in the room could feel the shift even if they did not yet understand it. And that was the part he could no longer control. Naomi remained exactly where she had been, her posture unchanged, her expression calm in a way that made everything else feel unsettled by comparison. And when she took a single step forward, it was not aggressive, not dramatic, just deliberate, the quiet kind of movement that draws attention without demanding it. "You had 3 chances," she said, her voice even, almost gentle, but grounded in something that did not need to be raised to be heard. And Sophie's breath caught slightly as she straightened instinctively, her earlier certainty now replaced by something far less stable. Ethan opened his mouth as if to respond, but paused, the words no longer forming as easily as they had minutes ago, and instead he glanced once more at the tablet, as if hoping for a different message to appear, one that might undo what had already been set in motion. But the screen remained unchanged, clear, direct, and undeniable. Across the room, the young girl shifted in her seat, her gaze moving between Naomi and the staff, sensing the gravity of the moment even if she could not fully name it, while her mother placed a quiet hand over hers, both of them watching closely now, not out of curiosity, but out of recognition. Naomi's eyes moved briefly to that table, just for a second, and something softened there, not weakness, not hesitation, but a quiet reminder of why she had walked into this space the way she did. And then her focus returned to Ethan, steady and unbroken. This place was built for people who have been told no too many times, she continued, her words measured, each one landing with intention. And you turned it into something else. And the statement did not accuse, it revealed, stripping away the distance Ethan had relied on and replacing it with something far more personal. Sophie took a small step back, the movement almost unconscious, as if trying to create space between herself and what was unfolding. But there was nowhere to step away to now, not from the room, not from the eyes that had begun to settle on her, not from the quiet understanding that had started to take shape. Ethan exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering just enough to show the weight he could no longer hide. And when he finally spoke, his voice had changed, less certain, more careful. "We can fix this," he said, but even as the words left him, they felt incomplete, like they belonged to a moment that had already passed. Naomi did not respond immediately, allowing the silence to settle. Again, deeper this time, more grounded, until even the smallest sounds seemed distant, and then she reached into her bag once more, not hurried, not hesitant, and pulled out a thin, worn card, its edges softened by time, and held it lightly between her fingers as she stepped closer to the hostess stand. The card caught the light just enough for Ethan to see the embossed lettering before she even spoke, and in that instant, before the words were said, before anything else could be explained, the truth arrived in full, undeniable, and final, standing there in the quiet space between them. The card rested between Naomi's fingers, simple, worn, unassuming, yet it carried a weight that the entire room could feel without fully understanding. And as she placed it gently on the hostess stand, the soft tap of its edge against polished wood echoed louder than it should have, drawing every remaining ounce of attention toward it. Ethan's eyes dropped to the embossed lettering, and this time he did not need a second glance. The name was unmistakable, printed in clean, deliberate lines that matched the one now standing in front of him, and whatever uncertainty he had been holding on to dissolved. In that instant, replaced by something far more immediate and far more real. Sophie leaned closer without meaning to, her breath shallow as her gaze followed his, and when she saw it, her posture shifted again, shoulders tightening, arms no longer crossed but uncertain, hands hovering as if unsure where they belonged. Naomi did not rush to explain, did not raise her voice. She simply let the truth sit there between them, visible, undeniable, and in that stillness, the entire structure of authority in the room began to rearrange itself without a single command being spoken. Across the dining area, conversations had fully quieted now, not out of obligation, but because something deeper than curiosity had taken hold, something that felt like recognition, like witnessing a line being redrawn in real time. Ethan straightened, but it was different this time, not the rigid posture of control, but the careful alignment of someone realizing he had been standing in the wrong place all along. Ms. Carter, he said, the name finally spoken aloud, and it changed everything. The room, the staff, the invisible distance that had defined the moment from the beginning, all of it shifted at once. Sophie's face paled slightly, her eyes flicking from Naomi to Ethan and back again. The confidence she had carried now replaced by a quiet, growing awareness of what she had done, not just a mistake, but something larger, something that could not be undone with a simple apology. Naomi's gaze moved between them, steady, composed, and when she spoke, her voice carried no anger, only clarity sharpened by experience. You decided who belongs here without ever asking why they walked in, she said, each word measured, each one landing with the kind of weight that does not need to be forced. Ethan opened his mouth again, but this time the response did not come, not because he did not want to speak, but because there was nothing left that could shift the truth back in his favor, and for the first time since this began, he lowered his eyes, not in defeat, but in recognition. Sophie swallowed, her voice barely forming. I did not know, she said, but even as the words left her, they felt smaller than the moment, insufficient against the reality now standing in front of her. Naomi's expression did not change, but something in her gaze deepened, not cold, not harsh, just certain. That is the problem, she replied quietly, and the simplicity of it carried more weight than any raised voice could have. A soft movement came from the open kitchen as Daniel stepped forward slightly, his eyes fixed on Naomi with a different kind of recognition, one that had been there long before this moment. And though he said nothing, his presence added another layer to the silence settling over the room. Naomi placed her hand lightly on the edge of the hostess stand, grounding herself not in the confrontation, but in the space she had built, and when she looked back at Ethan, there was no hesitation left, no uncertainty, only a calm, steady resolve that made what came next inevitable. And as the air seemed to hold its breath once more, the moment stood perfectly still, just before everything would change for good. The room did not erupt, it settled, and that was what made it heavier, the kind of silence that pressed gently but firmly against every person in it, as if asking them to sit with what had just been revealed rather than escape it. Naomi did not move right away, her hand still resting lightly on the edge of the hostess stand, fingers relaxed, grounding herself in the space not as a visitor, but as someone who had once stood in an empty building and imagined what it could become, and for a brief moment, the present blurred with memory, the sound of construction echoing in her mind, the scent of fresh paint, the quiet determination that had carried her through nights when no one believed this place would ever matter. Her eyes lifted slowly, not toward Ethan or Sophie, but across the room, taking in the details she had chosen with intention, the lighting meant to soften people's edges, the tables placed to invite conversation, the open kitchen designed to remove barriers, and somewhere along the way, those choices had been overshadowed by something colder, something she had not approved, and yet had taken root anyway. She exhaled, not in frustration, but in recognition, and when she spoke again, her voice was softer than before, almost reflective, yet it carried clearly through the quiet. "This place was never about exclusivity," she said, her words steady, measured. "It was about dignity." And the word seemed to linger in the air, simple, undeniable, forcing itself into the spaces where assumptions had lived unchecked. Ethan listened without interruption, his posture no longer defensive, but attentive in a way that suggested he was hearing something for the first time, not because the words were new, but because the moment had stripped away everything that had once allowed him to ignore them. Sophie lowered her gaze, her shoulders no longer squared, her earlier certainty replaced by something quieter, heavier, the kind of understanding that does not arrive all at once, but begins as a slow, undeniable shift. Naomi stepped away from the stand then, just one step, enough to create space, not distance, and the movement allowed the room to breathe again, though no one spoke, no one interrupted, as if they all understood that this moment was not meant to be filled with noise. Daniel remained near the edge of the kitchen, his presence steady, his eyes following Naomi with a quiet respect that had been there long before the rest of the room caught up. And though he said nothing, the way he stood, attentive, grounded, added a silent acknowledgement to everything unfolding. Naomi's gaze returned to Ethan, not sharp, not accusing, but clear, unwavering. And in that clarity was something more powerful than anger. It was expectation, the kind that does not demand loudly, but exists firmly, leaving no room for avoidance. "You cannot fix this with words," she said calmly, and the statement did not dismiss him. It guided him, set the boundary for what would come next, and Ethan nodded slightly, the movement small but meaningful, a recognition that whatever followed would require more than apology, more than surface correction. Across the room, the young girl leaned back slowly, her eyes still fixed on Naomi, but now there was something different in them, something steadier, as if the lesson unfolding in front of her had shifted direction, no longer about exclusion, but about what happens when someone refuses to accept it quietly. Naomi glanced toward her one more time, just briefly, and a faint, almost imperceptible warmth touched her expression before it settled back into calm resolve. And as she turned her attention fully back to the staff, the moment transformed again, no longer about what had happened, but about what would happen next. The kind of turning point that does not need to announce itself, because everyone can feel it arriving. The shift came not with a raised voice, but with a decision, quiet and deliberate, and Naomi's posture reflected it as she straightened slightly, no longer just addressing the moment, but defining what it meant. Her gaze moved from Ethan to Sophie, then briefly across the rest of the staff within view, each face now carrying a different version of the same realization. And when she spoke, her voice did not need to rise. It carried on its own, clear and steady, effective immediately. "This shift is over," she said, and the words did not echo. They settled, final, like a door closing without force but with certainty. Ethan blinked once, absorbing it, his mind moving quickly now, not to resist, but to understand the scope, the weight, the consequence, and he nodded slowly, the motion small but unmistakable, acknowledging what he already knew could not be undone. Sophie's lips parted slightly, as if to speak, to explain, to reach for something that might soften the outcome, but nothing came, because the moment had already moved past explanation, and all that remained was the truth of what had happened. Naomi did not rush through it, did not list names or raise accusations. She simply continued, her tone measured, precise. "Anyone who chose to enforce that decision, or stood by it, will be relieved of duty pending review." And though the words were formal, the meaning was deeply personal, rooted not in punishment, but in principle, in the standard that had been broken long before she walked through the door. Across the room, a quiet ripple moved through the staff, not loud, not chaotic, but unmistakable, a shift in weight, in posture, in breath, as each person measured their place within what had just been said. Daniel stepped forward then, just one step from the edge of the kitchen, his voice calm, respectful. "What do you need from me?" And the question was simple, but it carried something more, a willingness to stand in alignment rather than step back. And Naomi met his eyes, giving a slight nod, an acknowledgement that did not need words. "Stay," she said, just that. And it was enough to signal trust, enough to mark a difference between those who upheld the space and those who reshaped it into something else. Ethan lowered his gaze briefly, then lifted it again, steadier now. "Accepting. Understood," he said, and though the word was quiet, it carried the weight of someone stepping out of a position he had once held with certainty. Sophie stepped back another half-pace, her earlier confidence now fully replaced by a stillness that spoke louder than anything she could say, her hands clasping lightly in front of her as if trying to hold on to something that had already slipped away. Naomi's eyes moved once more across the room, taking in the guests, the space, the energy that had shifted so completely in such a short time, and there was no satisfaction in it, no triumph, only a calm resolve that this was what accountability looked like when it was done right. The young girl at the table watched intently, her posture straighter now, her expression different, no longer uncertain, but quietly grounded, as if something important had been restored in a way she could feel even if she could not yet explain it. Naomi exhaled slowly, the tension leaving her shoulders as the decision settled into place. And in that moment, the restaurant felt different again, not because of who had been removed, but because of what had been made clear. And as the staff began to move, slowly, carefully, following the direction that had just been set, the space itself seemed to breathe, resetting, returning to something closer to what it had always been meant to be. The movement that followed was not chaotic, it was careful, almost hesitant, like a room relearning how to exist under a different set of rules, and Naomi watched it all, without stepping in again, allowing the space to adjust on its own, because real change, she knew, did not come from being forced. It came from being understood. Ethan turned slightly, speaking quietly to a nearby staff member, his tone no longer authoritative but cooperative, guiding rather than commanding, and the difference was subtle, but it carried through the room, shifting the energy in ways no announcement ever could. Sophie remained near the hostess stand, her posture still, her expression caught somewhere between regret and realization, and after a moment, she took a small step forward, not toward Naomi, but toward the space she had once controlled, as if trying to understand it again from the beginning. Naomi noticed the movement, but did not interrupt, her attention instead moving across the dining area where guests had begun to settle back into their meals, though the atmosphere was different now, quieter, more aware, like everyone present had witnessed something that would stay with them longer than the evening itself. Daniel approached from the kitchen, carrying a simple plate, nothing elaborate, just a dish prepared with care, the kind that did not rely on presentation to prove its worth, and he placed it gently on a nearby table before turning to Naomi. "Would you like to sit?" he asked, his voice respectful, grounded, and Naomi paused for a moment, considering not the question, but what it meant to accept it now. She nodded once, a small, decisive motion, and walked toward a table near the window, the same one she had been denied minutes earlier, her steps unhurried, her presence steady, and as she sat, the chair made a soft sound against the floor, a quiet reminder that something had been restored, not just for her, but for the space itself. Across the room, the young girl watched again, but this time her gaze was different, no longer uncertain, no longer searching for answers, but calm, as if she had found something she could hold on to. And her mother gave her hand a gentle squeeze, both of them returning to their meal with a quiet sense of understanding. Sophie stood still for a moment longer, then slowly approached the edge of the dining area, stopping several feet from Naomi's table, not close enough to intrude, but not distant enough to ignore, and her voice, when it came, was soft, careful. "I am sorry," she said, the words simple, without defense, without justification, and Naomi looked up at her, meeting her gaze fully, not dismissing, not embracing, just acknowledging. "Do better," Naomi replied, her tone even, not harsh. but firm in a way that left no room for misunderstanding. And Sophie nodded quickly, the motion small, but sincere, before stepping back again, returning to the position she now understood differently. The restaurant continued to move, slowly regaining its rhythm, but the rhythm itself had changed, softer, more intentional, and Naomi picked up her fork, pausing for just a second before taking the first bite, not as an act of victory, but as something far simpler. The act of finally being served in a place that had momentarily forgotten what that meant, and in the quiet that followed, the space held steady, not perfect, but real, shaped not by appearance, but by the choices made within it. The restaurant did not return to what it had been before, and that was the point, because what had existed before was incomplete, and Naomi could feel the difference in the smallest details as she sat quietly near the window, the soft glow of the city lights reflecting against the glass, the hum of conversation rebuilding itself in a more careful, more conscious rhythm. She did not rush her meal, each bite measured, not out of hesitation, but presence, the kind that comes when a space finally aligns with its purpose again. And across the room, the staff moved differently now, not stiff, not fearful, but aware, as if each step carried a new understanding of what their roles actually meant. Daniel passed by once, giving a subtle nod, not seeking approval, not needing acknowledgement, just sharing a moment of quiet alignment, and Naomi returned it with the slightest lift of her gaze, enough to say that he had been seen long before today. Near the hostess stand, Sophie adjusted her posture again, this time not out of uncertainty, but intention, greeting a new guest with a softer expression, one that no longer measured worth by appearance. And though the change was small, it was real, and that was where it mattered most. Ethan remained near the back for a while, speaking with staff in low, steady tones, no longer directing from a distance, but stepping into conversations, listening more than speaking. And while the weight of the moment had not left him, it had shifted into something that could become growth, if he chose it. Naomi's attention drifted once more to the young girl, who now sat comfortably, her shoulders relaxed, her earlier tension replaced by something steadier, something quieter, and when their eyes met briefly, Naomi offered a faint, almost imperceptible smile, not as reassurance, but as recognition, and the girl mirrored it, just slightly, as if holding on to something she would carry beyond this night. Outside, a car passed slowly, its headlights sweeping across the window for a brief second before disappearing, leaving behind a softer darkness that felt calm rather than empty. And inside, the clink of glasses, the murmur of voices, the steady movement of service all blended into something whole again, not perfect, but honest. Naomi set her fork down gently, her meal nearly finished, and rested her hands lightly against the edge of the table, feeling the smooth surface beneath her fingertips, the same surface she had once chosen with care. And for a moment, she simply sat there, breathing, not as the owner, not as someone who had just corrected a wrong, but as a person who had stayed true to something deeper than the moment itself. No one approached her now, no one interrupted, and that quiet respect carried more meaning than any apology could have, because it was not given out of obligation, but out of understanding. Naomi stood slowly, her chair sliding back with a soft sound, and as she made her way toward the door, the space did not stop, did not pause. It continued, steady, grounded, but there was a subtle shift in the way people noticed her now, not with curiosity, not with surprise, but with a quiet awareness that something important had just passed through and left its mark. She reached the door, her hand resting briefly on the handle, and for a second, she looked back, not searching, not checking, just observing, taking in the room as it was now. And in that still moment, there was no need for words, no need for closure, because the silence itself held everything that mattered, the kind of silence that does not ask to be filled, because it already says enough.